Hello people, I am Piyush Goyal from Detox Technologies, and today I'll be talking about few of the Azure services and how you can enhance the security of your organization using few of the Azure practices. I'll be talking about few of the generic recommendations, generic in the sense that most of the organizations fail to implement these recommendations and are therefore a victim of attacks that regularly take place in Azure. So starting with the video series, I'll be talking about Azure Active Directory and conditional access, while also discussing few of the additional services in Azure. So let's start with it. I have my account here with Azure, where I am a global administrator, and let's move to Azure Active Directory. Okay, so as we can see, my role is global administrator, and this is necessary if we are looking for Azure to protect the Azure using conditional access. So we very well know how much importance the multi-factor authentication has, especially after we have seen the Twitter attack and most of the other companies that are being hacked are also due to the lack of MFA. So as we can see in the user section, we have multi-factor authentication, which we can enable or disable. This right is given to the global administrator to enable or disable the MFA for any of the users. And this can be a policy for an organization to enforce that so that no other user which is created does not have an MFA. So, okay, let's see. When we go to the Azure AD identity score, identity secure score, we can see some of the recommendations that we can implement in our Azure Active Directory. So this is quite similar to Azure Security Center if you are familiar with, but there are recommendations specifically for Azure Active Directory. For example, we can see here that ensure that all users complete multi-factor authentication, and it will provide us with the 30 points. We can also see that, okay, designate more than one global admin, improvement action, and it shows what's the user impact and the description. So the point here is that we can view what are the things that are needed for us to improve the security in Azure Active Directory, but we cannot enforce these rules. So for suppose if there is any user in Azure Active Directory which does not have MFA enabled, then we cannot do anything. We can just view the identity score, but we cannot restrict that user that, okay, do not that user does not be is not able to sign in without MFA. For that, we have conditional access. With conditional access, we can provide many of the things, like we can restrict the users based on their location, based on their country, based on their IP address, based on if MFA is enabled or not, and many other things. So MFA can be found in security, conditional access. Okay, so here I have a conditional access. So let's first talk about the location, how we can restrict certain users based on the location. We have named locations here where we can search for the location. First, we have to add a location. So let's say I type Afghanistan. So I do not want any of the traffic coming from Afghanistan. Let's name this as blocked access, and let's type the country. Let's say Afghanistan. So okay, so if there's any of the traffic coming from Afghanistan, or if there any user that tries to log in from Afghanistan IP, then it will restrict it. So we can create a new policy named blocked access, and we can have the country selected as Afghanistan. We can also select the IP addresses. Here I have another policy in which I have restricted United States. So let's see if it works. I go to the policies. I am in the policies, and I can see the location policy that I have made. Location is the name that I have given. I have selected the specific users. I can select the other users as well. So I have the list of users. So I have selected specific users. For cloud apps, I've selected all the cloud apps. For conditions, I have the location condition. So this is important. if I have to restrict from a particular country or from a particular IP address, then I have to include the selected locations and set the configure to yes, then select the selected locations and then select it. So I have two of the policies, one Afghanistan and one US. So I have selected US here. And the next thing is access controls. So there are two access controls, either to grant access or to block access. Here we have to block access coming from the US. So I set the block access. We can also set the grant access. And the final thing is enable policy. The report only policy will not enforce the policy, but generate a log whenever someone logs in from the US. The enable policy will restrict the user if someone logs in from the US. So let's see if we are successful. So let's log out once and sign in from the US region. So let me change my IP address using the VPN. Okay, so I'm connected to the US VPN. I think it didn't work. Okay, so I get the message, you cannot access this right now. So this was what I was talking about. As soon as I switch off this proxy, I'll be able to log in the portal. So these are what conditional access policy is all about. Let's see what more conditional access policy can do. So using this policy, we can restrict several of the countries. For example, your business thinks that, okay, China is a rogue country and you do not have any customer in China, then you can block China from this from this AD. Or in fact, you can whitelist the IP addresses from which a user can access. So you can whitelist the IP addresses and then allow only the selected IP addresses to log in. Okay, now let's talk about another policy. The next policy, which is even more important, is the legacy application, to block the legacy authentication from Azure. As most of the organizations are using, the Azure supports many of the legacy protocols, like there is POP protocol, or there's SMTP protocol, IMAP protocol. So these are legacy protocols and these do not support MFA. So if all the users are supporting MFA and without MFA in SMTP, any attacker would be able to hijack the user session or use the password spraying attack or use the brute force attack and obtain the session anyhow. So without MFA in all the legacy applications, you are still vulnerable. And as Azure reports, almost 67% of the attacks in Azure can be prevented if legacy application or legacy authentication protocols are blocked. So how can we block that? So in previous versions of conditional access, there was a simple switch to block the authentication for legacy protocols. But in now we have to create a policy. So let's create a policy. It's a simple policy. Let's name it as okay, block legacy. Let's select users and group all users. So the point here to note is that we have to exclude at least one user to not lock ourselves out. So in this case, let me exclude these users and put the policy on this. And okay, so we can select groups or we can select users to apply it on all cloud apps. This is as per the business needs, and set the conditions. Now condition is important. So these are few of the conditions. Let's say in client apps, we have to configure it to yes. And then we have to select exchange active sync clients and other clients only. We do not have to go for modern authentication like browser and mobile. We only have to restrict the legacy authentication clients. So exchange and other clients are the legacy authentication. A complete list of legacy authentication clients can be found in the documentation of Microsoft Azure, but mostly what are being used are POP, SMTP, IMAP, etc. Then we have to grant to block access. and we select it, and then we enable the policy to on. We do not set it to report only. uh, while testing it on prod or on live networks or on subscriptions which are live or prod subscriptions, we set it to report only to see if it is being reported in the conditional access or not before setting it to on. Because sometimes it happens that a user or a group of users are logged out or are locked from their accounts, and then in that case you'll have to contact the Microsoft to uh, lock you in or to log you in again. Okay, so we create the policy, and that's here it is. Block legacy application policy is set to on. In practical, it takes a few minutes to for these policies to come in effect, but as per Microsoft, password spraying attacks are 99% prevalent in legacy applications. Also, by blocking legacy applications, we'll be preventing those resource utilization and password utilization attacks to 97%. So in fact, in the identity score as well, is if you would have noticed, there are 20 points for blocking the. Okay, here it is. So enable policy to block legacy authentication, we have plus 20 points here as well. So these are some of the uh, things that we'll be talking today in Azure. And I'm sure I'll be talking about more of the Azure Active Directory best practices and more of the tweakings in Azure to make your organization a secure place. One thing to note here is that you will be needing Azure AD Premium for using the conditional access. You won't be able to use it in the free tier. You'll be needing the premium version. Also, you have to be global administrator to make any changes in the security or in the conditional access. So TuneUp will be releasing more of the videos on Azure security, and I'll be telling more things about Azure and how we can secure Azure. Thank you.